Hello, everybody. I've got here chapter 36 of Book 2 of the Royal Ranger series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. Cassandra ran across the courtyard to the keep. Standing to one side of the door, she ushered her men inside the large building, casting anxious glances at the massive gatehouse. She could hear the sound of fighting there. Half a dozen of her troops had been inside to tend to the drawbridge and portcullis. Now, they were fighting for their lives, desperately holding off the invaders, who were swarming across the bridge and into the gatehouse. There could be only one ending to that fight. The defenders were hopelessly outnumbered, and now they had been stripped of their greatest defense, the protection afforded by Castle Heirluin's impregnable walls. But their desperate delaying action might buy time for Cassandra and the rest of the depleted garrison to make it to safety. The troops in the barracks, warned by the clanging of the alarm bell, were streaming across the courtyard to join them. Seeing the last of her men go through into the keep, Cassandra followed them, slamming the door shut behind her and signaling for the locking bar to be set in place. The sergeant and another soldier heaved the massive oak bar into its brackets, securing the door. That would keep out the attackers for some minutes, until they could organize a battering ram and shatter the bar, then smash the door down. The keep was the castle's administration and accommodation center. It wasn't designed to be a defensive position in the event that an enemy had breached the walls. That was the South Tower's purpose. She pointed to two of the garrison soldiers, who were looking confused and alarmed at the events that were taking place. "You two," she ordered, and they snapped to attention. "Get my father from his room and take him to the South Tower. Right away." "Yes, my lady," the two men responded. Now that they had been given a definite task to carry out, they lost their uncertain looks and ran for the stairs. Duncan was in a room on the 4th floor. From there, they would take him across the arched stone bridge to the South Tower and then up into the tower's higher reaches. A few of the remaining servants had joined them, standing uncertainly, wondering what was going on. Among them, Cassandra saw Ingrid, Maddie's maidservant. She beckoned her over. "Fetch my daughter," she said. But Ingrid was shaking her head, a worried look on her face. "I've just been to her room, my lady," she said, "but she isn't in there. There was a bolster under her blankets to look as if she was in her bed, but I think she may have been patrolling outside the castle again." Ingrid was one of the few who knew Maddie's true identity as a ranger, and she was aware that she had been leaving the castle at night, although she wasn't sure why. Nor did she know how Maddie left the castle and re-entered. As her maid, it wasn't her place to question her mistress, and she knew that Maddie was skilled at moving from place to place without anyone seeing her do so. Cassandra hesitated, torn with anxiety. Then she realized that if Maddie weren't in the castle, she was relatively safe, at least for the meantime. She came to a decision. "Join the others and head for the 4th floor. We're withdrawing into the South Tower," she said. Ingrid nodded and hurried away, her concern for her mistress still evident on her face. Cassandra heard men shouting and hammering on the barred door, trying to break through, but for the moment they had only hand weapons, battle axes and swords, and they would be next to useless against the iron-bound oak planks. She knew, however, that it wouldn't take them long to find something heavy to use as a battering ram, and then it would be a different story. Even as she had that thought, she heard a voice shouting outside the door. "You 4 men," Damone said. "Grab that bench and bring it here. We're going to have to knock this door down." Outside, against the wall, was a heavy oak bench, Cassandra recalled. It would serve quite well as an improvised ram. The clattering of axes and swords and fists against the door ceased. A few minutes later, she heard footsteps approaching the door at a slow run. Then, something heavy slammed against the door, and it shuddered under the impact. Plaster and paint flew from the arch above the doorway. She heard Damone again. "Ready? 1, 2, 3. Slam! There was another massive impact against the door. More plaster and dirt fell from the lintel. This time she was sure she saw one of the big iron hinges move a centimeter or two as the bench struck the door. She felt a hand touch her sleeve. Maikeru. "My lady, we should be going. That door won't last long." She realized she had become fixated on the door as the men outside pounded on it. Maikeru was right. It wouldn't last much longer. Slam! Another thundering impact. And again, the hinge moved. She saw cracks forming in the stonework where the bolts secured the hinge to the door jamb. It was weakening fast. There were 3 other hinges, and so far none of them had moved. But once the first one gave way, the others wouldn't be far behind. She turned and took a quick count of the men who had made it into the keep with her. There were over a dozen of them, waiting for her next orders. She pointed to the stairs. "4th floor," she shouted, "then across to the south tower." Slam! Again, the bench hit the door, the sound of the impact echoing through the vast entry hall of the keep. Waiting no longer, she led the rush toward the broad staircase leading to the next level. Here in the keep, the stairways weren't designed for defense. They were broad and accessible and set in the center of each floor. Once they reached the south tower, they would be ascending the spiral staircase set in the southeast corner, with removable sections designed to delay pursuers. As they went up the successive flights, the sound of the bench hitting the door faded, but they could still hear it as they reached the 4th floor. And now there was a new quality to it, a splintering sound that told her the door was giving way. "Keep going," she shouted to the men following her, pointing the way toward the arched bridge that led to the south tower. She made sure they were following her order, then detoured to her own apartments, where she gathered up a few pieces of clothing, crammed them into a bag, and her katana. She slid the sword, in its lacquered wood scabbard, through her belt so that the long hilt stood ready to her right hand. Her sling was on her desk, coiled neatly. She slipped it under her belt, on the side opposite her sword. There was a chamois pouch of lead shot on the desk as well, and she slung it quickly over her shoulder. She took a quick final look around her apartment. There were just too many possessions in here, and not enough time to choose between them. In the end, she left them, and hurried toward the door that led to the bridge. Maikeru and the sergeant from the battlements were both waiting there for her. Maikeru was as inscrutable as ever. The sergeant was nervous, worried for her welfare, she realized. She gestured for him to lead the way across the bridge, and he turned, albeit reluctantly, and headed for the south tower. She gave Maikeru a wan little smile. "After you, sensei," she said, using the Nihonjan word for teacher. He shook his head. "You first, my lady. Emperor Shigeru charged me with your safety." She was about to reply when another voice interrupted them, shouting from the top of the stairs leading from the floor below. "Cassandra! Stop there!" She turned and looked back, and her heart sank as she saw that it was Damone, blood-stained sword in hand, and blood staining his doublet, ascending the last few stairs to the 4th floor level. She had clung to the hope that it had been an impostor she had seen riding across the drawbridge, that her loyal retainer and captain of the guard had not betrayed her. Now she saw that hope dashed. Maikeru moved to interpose himself between her and the traitor now. His katana slid from its scabbard with a whisper of steel and wood. She drew her own sword and stepped to one side so she could see Damone clearly. He stopped 5 meters away, wary of the old Nihonjan swordmaster. He glanced behind him to where 2 of his men were emerging from the stairway. "Damone," she said in a stricken voice, "what are you doing? Why are you doing this?" His eyes were cold. Because the throne is mine by right, he said angrily. For years, your family has denied me my birthright, changing the law so that a woman could inherit the crown. I've been pushed aside, and since I've been here, I've been forced to bend the knee to you, to smile and pretend everything is fine. Yes, my lady. No, my lady. Is there anything I can do for you, my lady? Well, everything isn't fine. I'm sick of bowing and scraping to you and your daughter. My legitimate claim to the throne has been ignored, pushed aside, trampled on. Your legitimate claim? You have no legitimate claim. I'm the heir, and Mattie will be my heir in turn. I am the only male member of the royal family, and that means I'm the only legitimate heir, he shouted at her, years of anger and frustration suddenly bursting loose. I may be a distant relative, but I am a relative, and the only male one. Our ancient law says that I should be the one to inherit the crown. She spread her hands wide in confusion. But that law was revoked years ago. My grandfather changed it. And he had no right to do so, Damone shouted. He did it to protect his own interest, to protect his immediate family's claim to the throne, to make sure that you succeeded Duncan. That's ridiculous. I wasn't even born when he changed that law. How could he know? He waved her argument aside with a furious gesture. He was making sure that his family would stay in power. If Duncan had a son, well and good. But if he had a daughter, he said, pointing his sword at her, then his line would continue on the throne. The law of male succession has been in place for hundreds of years, perhaps thousands. He had no right to change it. It was a good law, one that had been tested by time. It was an unfair law, and that's why he changed it, Cassandra told him, and he gave a derisive snort of laughter. Of course you'd say that, he said. It's in your interest to say that. You'd say anything to ensure that you and that brat of yours remained in power. As he mentioned Mattie, he waved his hand vaguely toward the bridge behind her, and Cassandra began to realize that he had no idea Mattie was missing from the castle. His words and that gesture seemed to indicate that he thought she was with her mother's party, hurrying to the South Tower, and as she had that thought, a small flame of hope began to burn in her breast. Now lower your sword and surrender, he said. I'll see you're well treated. She gave a bitter laugh, seeing through the lie with no difficulty. You won't let me live, she said. If you want the throne, you'll have to kill me. You can't afford to leave a legitimate claimant alive. His face worked briefly, and she saw in his eyes that she was right. He would kill her, and Madeline, to cement his claim to the throne. Then she had a moment of revelation. Nobody would know that he had seized the throne by force. The only witnesses to that would be in the castle, and by the time he was through, they'd be dead. He could blame the entire affair on the Red Fox clan, and claim that he had driven them off, unfortunately, too late to save Cassandra, Mattie, and Duncan. My lady, Mycaru said quietly, you must go now. I will settle with this cur. She hesitated. Mycaru was right. She should run for the South Tower now, while she had the chance. But she had a sudden flare of rage. She wanted to be the one who finished Damone. She wanted to feel her sword cutting into him. Get out of my way, old man. Damone's voice was scornful, but she noticed that he made no more move toward the old swordmaster. He was cautious of Mycaru, wary of his skill and his speed, and that flashing, razor-sharp katana. Mycaru kept his eyes fastened on the treacherous guard commander. He spoke again, still without any sign of emotion. You must go now, my lady. This is the task the Emperor gave me when he sent me to you. Sadly, she realized he was right. She sheathed her sword, turned toward the South Tower, and began to make her way across the bridge, looking back over her shoulder. Mycaru had moved so that he was in the middle of the bridge, barring the way. Cassandra, stop there! I warn you! Damone shouted, his voice cracking with rage. dog like you does not speak to my lady in that fashion," Maikeru said calmly. His calmness acted as a goad to Damone, who leapt forward, his sword swinging up and back, then coming down on a diagonal at the swordmaster, only to be intercepted by the gleaming katana. The hardened blade rang against Damone's sword and left a deep notch in the steel. Then Maikeru flicked his opponent's sword to one side, and with astonishing speed, brought the katana back in a short, cutting stroke. Damone blocked it with his shield, but Maikeru followed up immediately with a bewildering series of strokes, cutting left and right at Damone's head. One caught his helmet and sheared its owl's head crest clean off. Damone staggered with the force of the blow, and Maikeru's next stroke caught him in the left shoulder, just above the rim of his shield, slicing through the chain mail and drawing blood. It was only a shallow cut, but the ease with which Maikeru penetrated his defense startled Damone. He leapt back and gestured to the men behind him. "Kill him," he snarled. The two men started forward, then hesitated. The narrow bridge only allowed room for one of them to attack him at a time. Then one stepped forward, his sword point low and moving in a circle, his eyes slitted. He lunged at Maikeru, hoping that he would catch the old man off guard. His sword was deflected immediately, and as he staggered slightly, the katana slashed quickly across his neck, and he fell, a choked scream rising to his lips. His companion watched in horror, then realized his mistake as Maikeru went on the attack. Once again, the deadly katana found its mark and sliced through the chainmail and flesh. The second man fell, lifeless, to the bridge. Maikeru smiled grimly at Damone. "Would you care to try again?" he invited. Damone looked around desperately. More of his men were pouring up the stairs, and he saw that two of them had short bows slung across their shoulders. "You two," he yelled. "Come here. Bring your bows." The two men ran to him, unslinging the bows as they did. Maikeru's eyes narrowed. This put a different complexion on things. He glanced over his shoulder and saw that Cassandra was at the end of the bridge, looking back at him. "Go, my lady," he shouted. "Run now!" With a sigh of relief, he saw her turn and run into the south tower, slamming the heavy door behind her. She would be safe now, he thought. He had fulfilled the task laid upon him by his emperor. "Shoot him," Damone ordered, pointing his sword at the slightly built figure who barred their way. The first of the men knocked, drew, and released. The arrow sped toward Maikeru, barely visible, but he calmly batted it aside with his sword. Damone shook his head in surprise. He had never seen such lightning reflexes. "Both together," he ordered. The two bows thrummed almost in the same instant. Maikeru caught the left-hand arrow on his sword, but the other slammed into his chest, high on the right side. He staggered under the impact and stumbled against the parapet of the bridge, his sword still in his hands, but the point now lowered. The two men shot again, and two more arrows slammed into him, both hitting vital spots. The old swordmaster sank to his knees, leaning against the rough stone wall, and still keeping his grip on his katana. He saw Damone's tall figure stepping cautiously toward him. The traitor was only a dark shape now, as Maikeru's sight began to fade. But Cassandra was safe, for now. He looked up at the shadowy form above him. "You lose," he said softly, and died. All right, well, that's going to be the end of Chapter 36. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you all next time in Chapter 37. God bless, and have a good one.